Faith. Faith in this simple expression that we have in our day's text today has allowed imperfect people to do extraordinary things, including moving forward and accepting enormous changes and assignments, moving to new lands, really being able to face challenges of all kinds. The Apostle Paul discussed the power of this faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Let's open our Bibles there. Now here, the Apostle Paul recounted various outstanding examples of faith, and he noted what it was that helped these individuals to be able to accomplish what they did. Let's start with Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 5. Now here, Paul starts out by talking about Enoch. Now we remember Enoch was the one who preached a message against the ungodly people of his generation, a very wicked generation. Well, what did Jehovah do because of that man's great faith in Jehovah's promise? Well, it says in verse 5 that God transferred him. I think that was probably the most seamless reassignment in history, because he was just immediately in his new assignment. We're waiting to catch up with him. What a wonderful day that will be when those living on the earth will be able to meet that faithful man who was reassigned to that new earth. But what about Abraham? For Abraham, it was a little bit more complicated. You see in verse 8, it tells us that Abraham was called when he was living in the city of Ur, no doubt in a very comfortable situation. You'll recall that Ur was an advanced city in the ancient world. In fact, even having indoor plumbing in many of the homes, very unusual for its time. But where was Abraham asked to go? Well, according to verse 8, it says, he went out, although not knowing where he was going. Well, now that really took faith, didn't it? Accepting an assignment, not even knowing what Jehovah had in mind. Well, why was Abraham able to do that? He had faith in the promise of a new heavens and a new earth. You see, verse 10, what it says? For he was awaiting the city having real foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Well, verse 13 adds, speaking of all these ones, including Abraham, in faith all of these died, although they did not receive the fulfillment of the promises, but they saw them from a distance and welcomed them and publicly declared that they were strangers and temporary residents in the land. For those who speak in such a way make it evident that they are earnestly seeking a place of their own. And yet, if they had kept remembering the place from which they had departed, they would have had opportunity to return. Really an interesting thought. But then it says, but now they are reaching out for a better place, that is, one belonging to heaven. Therefore, God is not ashamed of them to be called on as their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Well, those men and women of faith, they were willing to be strangers, temporary residents, go wherever Jehovah asked them to go because of their faith. They knew that Jehovah had a place, that new heavens, that new earth that had been prepared. But they're not the only ones who had faith like that. Consider Moses. Now, at age 40, he made the long journey from Egypt to Midian. And there, Jehovah had him receive training for the next 40 years. Can you imagine? Before he gave him the assignment to go back to Egypt and have a role in setting free the Israelites. Well, of course, his work was only beginning there, because then he had to go right back into the wilderness for another 40 years. Well, his faith meant that he had to move, and he had to take on new assignments. What about Jesus? What does Philippians chapter 2 and verse 7 say? It says, he emptied himself and took a slave's form and became human. Well, now, you want to talk about a huge change of assignment? I think that's the biggest one, leaving heaven and coming to earth and becoming a human. But Jesus accepted that assignment because of his faith in the arrangement that Jehovah had foretold. What about Christian believers in the first century? Now, we're not talking here about the disciples or the apostles. We're just talking about ordinary, average members of the congregation in the first century. Well, Acts chapter 8 and verse 1 says that a great persecution arose against the congregation that was in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. What did it mean? Everyone had to move. Every single believer had to move. They were all scattered because of their faith. Well, what was the result? Actually, something very positive came from it. Verse 4 says, "However, those who had been scattered went through the land declaring the good news of the word." Well, it actually became a blessing because as those Christians were scattered, they carried the kingdom message with them, and the truth just continued to prosper. The kingdom message was made known. Well, what can we see from all of this? It's not unusual for servants of Jehovah to receive new assignments, and especially ones that may require us to move to new lands, new locations, accept new assignments, new roles. That's a common thing in the history of God's people. I recall in 2008, one day I was working at my desk in Patterson. Two members of the governing body called me on a Friday afternoon. They asked me if I would be willing to accept an assignment in the Philippines. Well, they said, if you're willing to accept this assignment, then you're going to begin attending branch school on Monday morning. Keep in mind, this is Friday at 3. Well, I asked them, what about my work? I loved my work in the service department. The brother said, just walk away. Well, Monday morning, I was in branch school. Of course, when you receive an assignment like that, so many different feelings go through your mind and heart, including joy, fear, excitement, anxiety, perhaps even a measure of terror. And I'll have to say, I'll never forget the day when that van finally pulled up to take me to the airport to go to the Philippines. And I realized that now I was cutting my ties with the U.S. branch in a sense and moving on to a completely new assignment. I was really leaving. It was quite a feeling. But in a short time, I saw that in my new assignment, I had found a whole new spiritual family. And they had a work that was so enjoyable and so rewarding that I truly, truly hated to leave it when I was reassigned to come back to the United States. I often, in fact, think of how much I would have missed out in my life if I would have said no to that new assignment. It truly enriched my life. Well, our faith in that promise of the new heavens and a new earth will cause us to move also. Certainly, all of us who live here in Brooklyn are all going to move, every one of us. But in truth, every person who has the earthly hope is also going to move. They're going to move from this dying world into God's new world of righteousness. And what about the anointed? All of those anointed ones who receive their final sealing, well, they're all going to have to move to the heavens, aren't they? So if and when Jehovah has in mind for us to take up a new assignment, let's move ahead with full faith and confidence, knowing that Jehovah has wonderful, wonderful blessings in store for us, and that he will lovingly and generously care for us no matter where we go.